Over the black ribbon of the Potomac, two sets of strobes closed the distance no one on the ground could measure. Until they did. A controller's calm cadence spiked, a pilot's voice clipped, and then the river answered with silence. Within seconds, phones lit up along the waterfront. Within minutes, Washington's most protected airspace felt suddenly porous. Buried inside the chaos is a pattern, a chain of near-invisible choices, habits, and design trade-offs that set the stage long before the impact. What really collided over the Potomac wasn't just metal. It was a system straining at its limits. And the clues are hiding in the recordings, the radar returns, and the overlooked corners of a winter sky. To understand what failed over the Potomac that winter evening, we first mapped the final minutes as they unfolded on radar scopes, radio frequencies, and along the riverbank. The reconstruction that follows draws on publicly available ATC recordings and open-source ADS-B archives, cross-checked against early witness accounts. Precise timestamps will likely be refined by investigators, but the sequence is already clear enough to trace the narrowing margins. The river, normally a visual reassurance that keeps traffic aligned to Washington's strict airspace, became the only line both aircraft could share. Roughly 7 to 8 minutes before impact, both targets were inside the special flight rules area, squawking discrete codes and moving in opposite directions along the same geographic thread. One aircraft hugged the Potomac's curves in the way pilots do when cleared to follow the river. The other approached on a converging path that would bring it toward the same corridor near the familiar landmarks south of the downtown bridges. Controllers working Potomac Tracon sectors and the Reagan National Tower maintained the routine cadence, headings, altitudes, handoffs, that sounds almost soothing until the plots begin to compress. Nothing in the voices suggests alarm yet. The complexity is in the picture, not the tone. About 5 minutes before impact, the geometry hardens into conflict. The ADS-B traces show lateral separation eroding as both tracks move toward a common waypoint, defined not by a fixed name but by the river's narrowing banks. Vertical spacing is limited by the low ceiling of Washington's restricted airspace, and the need to keep aircraft below arriving or departing traffic, a common constraint in this corridor. On the frequency, you can hear the tempo quicken, clearances clipped a shade shorter, acknowledgements stepping on each other by a half beat, a controller issuing a traffic advisory that, in the moment, sounds almost routine. The see and avoid compact that underpins visual flight in congested airspace is now working at closing speeds that cut the time to resolve from minutes to heartbeats. At roughly the 3-minute mark, handoffs tighten the funnel. One aircraft is told to continue along the river, the other is reassigned or cleared to maintain a visual, with altitudes that leave little vertical buffer. This is the choreography that usually works. Controllers build a picture, pilots build their own, and the two match. But winter light is unforgiving. A low sun, a sheen off dark water, and the pinprick glare of opposing strobes can conspire to turn recognition into delay. The public ADS-B logs suggest either a small altitude change by one aircraft or a steady descent by the other. In either case, the vertical gap shrinks at the same time lateral lines converge. With 90 seconds to go, the pattern on the screen takes on a telltale shape, two vectors that will meet unless someone turns or climbs. On the recordings, there is a stepped-on transmission, two voices at once, followed by a request to say again. That sliver of lost clarity matters. In busy airspace, clarity is currency, and the price of paying twice for 1 second is often paid later. Witnesses clustered at Gravelly Point and along the Mount Vernon Trail describe seeing two sets of lights, one higher, one lower, that seem to align and then merge. Others recall the sound of engines changing pitch and a brief flash that could have been reflection, collision, or both. The details vary, but the arc is consistent. The river held the line, and the aircraft crossed it at the same time. In the final 30 seconds, ADS-B ground speeds and headings suggest little room left for maneuver. If cockpit alerting was active, any traffic advisory would have left only seconds to react. If crews were heads down, managing clearances or verification calls, those seconds slip faster. The last clean radar return precedes a burst of partial transmissions, the familiar clutter of a frequency that suddenly loses its rhythm. Then, the tracks disappear. The silence on the air and the dark water below say the same thing. Minute by minute, the sequence points less to a single mistake than to a convergence of design, habit, and human timing in one of America's most controlled pieces of sky. To see it clearly, we now have to name the two aircraft, follow their routes into the corridor, and understand the people at their controls. Only then can the geometry become human. In the compressed geometry of that evening, two flights entered the same ribbon of sky with very different purposes. Authorities have not released full identities or a definitive manifest as investigators work through the wreckage and recordings. But the public record already traces two distinct profiles: a professionally crewed air carrier arrival descending along the river toward Reagan National, and a smaller civil aircraft transiting the Potomac corridor under visual flight rules. They were not strangers to this airspace. Both were doing what pilots do here every day: following the water, meeting clearances, trusting that the choreography would hold. The inbound flight had the predictability of a line on a chart. Cleared from Potomac Tracon and handed to the tower for a visual segment, the crew would have briefed the river visual to runway 19, a procedure that literally uses the Potomac as a guide. In winter twilight, that means tracking the dark bend past Rosslyn, spotting the Key Bridge, and keeping the Washington Monument off the left shoulder as the river leads the nose toward the field. The cockpit workload rises in a familiar way: flaps coming out, descent checks, a scan split between instruments and the windscreen. A two-pilot crew divides the labor. One flies, one talks, both look. Even under a visual clearance, they remain on an IFR plan and in communication, but the implicit pact of see and avoid becomes a living part of the approach. The downriver aircraft fit the other half of this region's routine. Within the special flight rules area, even VFR traffic must file and squawk a discrete code. In practice, that means a pilot checks in with Potomac, is assigned a number, and is often asked to follow the river to remain clear of the flight-restricted zone that wraps the heart of the capital. It could be a training hop between suburban reliever airports, a repositioning leg, or a local flight taking advantage of a clear window. In all cases, the technique is the same: hug the Potomac, report when instructed, and keep speeds modest to leave room to maneuver. Single-pilot operations in this corridor demand a taut scan, eyes outside for traffic and inside to mind altitude gates that keep you under arrival paths into Reagan. What put them nose to nose was less a mistake than converging standard practices. The carrier crew descending on the river path that becomes a leftward swing toward the runway would have been looking into a complex wash of lights and reflections ahead. The VFR pilot, tracking upriver with the capital's glow forming a halo over the bridges, would see strobes and landing lights approaching with deceptive steadiness. Airspeed, mass, and closure rates were asymmetrical by design: a faster, heavier aircraft descending into the corridor and a lighter one holding a stable river track. And that asymmetry compresses decision time even when everyone is exactly where they're supposed to be. The human details matter. In the jet, the first officer flying the approach, if that was the cockpit pairing, would be calling for configuration changes on schedule, listening for a traffic advisory while the captain worked radios and scanned. In the smaller cockpit, a solo pilot or an instructor-student pair would be balancing the monotony of a familiar route with the heightened vigilance the SFRA demands. Both crews would have rehearsed the etiquette of the sky: acknowledge advisories crisply, keep your altitude, report the traffic when you've got it, and don't stray east into the FRZ. On a benign evening, it is a rhythm as practiced as a metronome. Their routes crossed at a point that locals recognize without a name: the stretch where the river narrows and the flight paths of those arriving to 19 run, in close company with the VFR river track. The inbound's ground track curves gently along the west bank, before angling toward the field. The upriver track holds the center line of water, avoiding the invisible wall to the east. That geometry yields safety margins, measured in seconds and hundreds of feet, not miles, and it relies on an unbroken chain of small confirmations. See the traffic, make the call, adjust early rather than late. What tied both aircraft to that sliver of sky were the rules that define Washington's airspace and the procedures that make Reagan National workable in the first place. The river is more than scenery here. It's an artery, a boundary, and sometimes a trap. To understand why both crews were where they were, and why controllers rely on water as a way to route metal, we need to walk through the alphabet soup that governs this region: the SFRA, the FRZ, and the river visual itself. Only then does the logic and the limitation of this corridor come into sharp relief. For pilots, Washington's skyline isn't just scenery, it is a map of invisible fences. Since 9/11, the nation's capital has been girded by layers of special-use airspace that turn the Potomac River from a postcard into a rule. The outer ring is the 30 nautical miles special flight rules area, a blanket that requires even VFR pilots to file a plan, squawk a discrete code, and stay in constant radio contact. Inside that sits the tighter flight-restricted zone, a roughly 15-mile bubble where access is limited to vetted operators and flights meeting specific security programs. Threaded through these protections are prohibited zones, most notably P-56 over the White House and the National Mall, that make overflight not merely unwise but illegal. In this maze, the river is both boundary and permission. Follow it, and you stay where you're allowed. Stray from it, and you are not. The SFRA reshaped routine flying here. What used to be a simple transition from one side of the metro area to the other became a procedure, beginning with a phone call or electronic filing and ending only when the aircraft is out of the ring and the transponder code is canceled. Controllers at the Potomac TRACON expect those calls. They assign codes, verify positions, and keep a mental picture of who is correctly in the box. For pilots in light aircraft, the SFRA demands more planning and tighter cockpit discipline. There is less room for improvisation and less tolerance for ambiguity. A missed call or wrong digit on a code isn't just sloppy. It can trigger law enforcement responses that nobody wants to see. The inner FRZ tightens the aperture further. A handful of airports, College Park, Potomac Airfield, and Hyde Field, known collectively as the Maryland 3, operate inside it under a security regime that requires background checks and pre-authorization. Corporate and airline operations at Reagan National participate through their own access programs. Everyone else, from tour helicopters to transiting trainers, must remain outside the FRZ unless specifically cleared. The effect is to push legal, cleared VFR movement into narrow grooves that respect the inner ring and the prohibited areas. The Potomac, tracing a westward arc past the monuments, forms the most predictable of those grooves. Then there is the river visual, the local shorthand for an arrival path that keeps airline jets out of P-56 while delivering them to runway 19. It is not a casual choice. It's a published visual procedure with defined landmarks and controller responsibilities. In practice, an arriving crew turns south to pick up the river near Chain Bridge, or the American Legion Bridge, keeps the Key Bridge off the right wingtip, threads between Rossland's Towers and the Kennedy Center, and holds the Washington Monument in sight to the left. Past the Roosevelt Bridge, the river bends toward the airport. The final turn to line up with the runway comes late, over the park at Gravelly Point. The crew remains on an IFR clearance, but the final segment is flown visually, with the tower confirming that weather and visibility meet the criteria and that pilots can maintain visual reference to the water and the preceding traffic. As a piece of airspace design, it's elegant. Water as wayfinding, architecture as checkpoints, and a natural noise abatement path that spares the mall. As operations stack up, the elegance thins into constraint. Airline arrivals, often descending through a few thousand feet, must hug the river's bends. VFR flights permitted within the SFRA, but outside the FRZ are often instructed to follow the river for their own transitions. Helicopters, too, are routed along it under separate rules. The lateral space that seems generous on a wall chart shrinks in 3 dimensions, especially when you carve out the east side to avoid P-56 and hold the west side for obstacle clearance and neighborhood noise concerns. What remains is a braided stream of traffic flowing in opposite directions along the same visual cue. Altitude doesn't provide much breathing room. The airspace above the river is part of the Class B for Washington, but arrivals are descending, departures are climbing, and VFR traffic is often asked to remain at specific low altitudes to stay clear of both. Controllers maintain prescribed separations until they can delegate visual separation to pilots who have each other in sight. On perfect days, this works. The river offers a high-contrast ribbon. The bridges mark distance like notches on a ruler, and the choreography looks effortless. On marginal days, or on clear days with harsh winter light, the same geometry compresses attention and reduces the time available to reconcile two moving pictures, the pilots and the controllers, into one. The river's bends add their own optical traps. A head-on target on a straight line grows in the windscreen. A target sliding around a bend can hold a steady bearing until the moment it doesn't. Reflections off dark water can hide strobes until you're close. Monument lighting and roadway glare can generate false signatures of movement. At night or at dusk, the balance between seeing the river and seeing traffic becomes a deliberate scan that can falter just when decisions need to be made. None of this is exotic. It is the accepted price of operating safely and efficiently in a sensitive corridor. All of which explains how a natural feature became both guide and bottleneck. The Potomac tells pilots where to be and reassures the public that airplanes aren't over forbidden ground. It also concentrates different kinds of aircraft, flying under different rules, into a shared channel where the margins are measured in seconds and hundreds of feet. When it works, it is seamless enough to be invisible. When it breaks, every assumption built into the design is tested at once. Those assumptions are managed by people sitting at scopes and radios just south of the river's final bend. To understand how the system tries to keep this narrow corridor safe, how phraseology, handoffs, speed control, and split-second judgments are used to weave IFR and VFR flows, we need to step inside the control room and listen to the rhythm on the other end of the frequency. Step into Potomac Tracon, and the light drops. The room is a constellation of radar scopes, dim enough to make the returns glow, quiet enough that a clipped instruction carries to the next sector over. Washington's airspace doesn't run itself. It is shepherded by controllers who build and maintain a moving picture of aircraft flowing around a city that tolerates no imprecision. On the evening of the collision, that picture included the usual mix: airline arrivals descending along the river, departures climbing southwest, helicopters threading their own routes, and a handful of VFR transitions hugging the water under watchful instruction. The job is to keep each stream separate until they can safely occupy the same corridor, then to choreograph how they pass. Workload here has a rhythm. Arrival banks push traffic into the terminal area in clumps, and the approach sectors feed Reagan National a conga line that must bend to the Potomac before turning to the runway. Each controller's display, driven by the STARS automation system, presents data blocks with call signs, altitudes, and ground speeds, alongside minimum vectoring altitudes and scratchpad annotations that mark intentions: river visual, straight in, speed restrictions. Adjacent sectors exchange automated handoffs, but busy moments still require old-fashioned coordination. Point-outs for VFR targets outside the normal flow, quick verbal heads-ups if a slow mover threatens to pinch the gap between two jets, and a shared understanding of how the river keeps everyone honest. Phraseology is the thread that holds this together. Clearances are not prose. They are compressed commands designed to be unambiguous at 200 knots. Maintain 2,000, follow the river, tells an inbound crew to stay low and stay visual. Traffic 12 o'clock, 2 miles, opposite direction. Altitude indicates 1,800, frames a decision point for both parties. When the controller hears "in sight," a new tool comes into play: the delegation of visual separation. Under FAA rules, if a pilot reports the traffic and is told to maintain separation, responsibility shifts in a precise legal way from the scope to the cockpit. Used well, this buys capacity without sacrificing safety. Used late, it leaves pilots solving geometry with seconds to spare. Handoffs are the choreography behind the voices. Approach controls the river inbounds until the last curve, then transfers them to the tower for the final turn and landing clearance. The tower, perched above the field with a bright radar repeater as a second set of eyes, owns the near-airport bubble. Runway crossings, wake turbulence spacing, helicopter crossings to the Pentagon helipad. At the same time, approach may keep a VFR aircraft on its frequency as it transits the river corridor, coordinating a point out with the tower to ensure everyone is tracking the target. When flows intersect, those lines must be tight. A late handoff, a stepped-on transmission, or a call sign read back incorrectly can introduce just enough latency to turn prediction into surprise. Speed control is another lever, especially when opposing flows share the same waterline. On busy evenings, arrivals are often told to keep the speed up to a specific point, then slow to configure for landing, a tactic that compacts the gap behind them but reduces the time they have to see and resolve traffic ahead. VFR aircraft, many of them slower, are sometimes asked to adjust or to hug one bank of the river, but only within what's safe and legal. Against this, the controller weighs the terrain and security constraints. East of the water lies the prohibited zone. To the west are towers and neighborhoods, and above are departures and farther out traffic. The result is a three-dimensional puzzle assembled in real time where every piece is moving. Inside the room, alerts help but do not replace judgment. Conflict alert algorithms flash when two data blocks close too fast or lose approved separation, and controllers can tag targets with visual cues on their scopes. But false alarms are common in a visual corridor where the rules allow closer proximities once pilots take responsibility. So controllers learn the strip of sky by feel, where the key bridge sightline tends to compress, where the river's bend can make opposing traffic seem stationary, where a helicopter's crossing might mask a slower airplane behind it. They also learn to read the tapes in their heads. Who has just checked in? Who is likely to call next? And which voice sounded a beat more uncertain than it should have? When the system is under strain, the cadence changes subtly. Instructions shorten, requests to say again multiply. Acknowledgements overlap by fractions of a second. A good controller finds slack, vectoring an arrival a hair wider to buy sight distance, nudging a VFR up or down within allowed altitudes, or holding a helicopter for a minute to unclutter the picture. All of it lives within a manual, but the manual assumes calm. The art is knowing how far to stretch calm when the river is crowded and the light is unkind. That art met its limits over the Potomac. The tapes capture a sector trying to keep two truths aligned: that the river is the safest path through the capital's defenses, and that it forces unlike aircraft into close company. The next perspective lies beyond the scopes and headsets, in the places where those instructions land. Two cockpits navigating glare, workload, and split-second choices, with alerting systems chiming in a language of their own. From the frequency, the instruction is crisp. Inside the cockpit, it lands as a cascade. Maintain 2000, follow the river, traffic 12 o'clock, opposite direction. In an airline jet descending toward runway 19, the monitoring pilot's eyes snap outside while the flying pilot keeps the approach stable. Speed on schedule, vertical path sensibly shallow, flaps stepping as briefed. Sterile cockpit rules below 10,000 feet sharpen the focus. No small talk, no distractions. If the crew hears traffic, a well-worn script unfolds. Looking, then traffic in sight if they have it, or negative contact if not. The moment in sight is spoken, and the controller delegates visual separation, the picture inside the cockpit is no longer advisory. It is an obligation to solve a geometry problem at closing speeds measured in football fields per second. Across the river in a smaller cockpit, single pilot or a trainer with an instructor, the script is leaner and the workload steeper. The pilot is still working the SFRA checklist. Confirm discrete code, verify altitude, track the waterline that keeps P56 to the left. Eyes flick between outside scan and the tablet on the yoke showing ADS-B traffic overlaid on a moving map. If equipped with ADS-B in, the display paints diamonds with relative altitude tags. Plus 102 means 200 feet above. 05 means 500 below. It is useful, but imperfect. Traffic Information Service broadcast fills in some targets by rebroadcasting radar returns, but latency and coverage gaps exist. Not everyone is broadcasting their position in a way that your particular receiver can see in real time. Even when the tablet shows another aircraft, translating a symbol at 12 o'clock 2 miles plus 03 into a dot in a cluttered windscreen is a learned skill under the best light. Airliners bring a different kind of aid. TCAS-2, now standard in Part 121 operations, watches transponder replies and issues a chime when a traffic advisory becomes a resolution advisory. RAs are not suggestions, they are commands. Climb, climb, or descend, descend, that crews are trained to follow even if air traffic instructions conflict. Yet TCAS is vertically focused. It does not turn you, it changes your altitude, and it only sees aircraft that are interrogating or replying. It can be inhibited near the ground to avoid false cues. Airlines with glass cockpits may also display ADS-B traffic, but it is a supplement, not a primary collision avoidance tool. In a tight visual corridor like the Potomac, the last line of defense remains what pilots call the big sky, little airplane problem managed by disciplined scan. That scan is both art and arithmetic. Training texts teach a deliberate pattern: 10-degree slices of sky, 2 seconds per stop, eyes refocusing at infinity, then back to instruments. Human factors research gives the limits. In daylight, a cockpit crew may take a dozen seconds to detect a small head-on target. At a combined closure rate of 240 to 300 knots, that detection could arrive with less than half a minute left to decide and act. If a target holds a constant bearing with increasing size, a classic constant relative motion cue, it may not trip the brain's motion detectors until it suddenly fills the view. Add cockpit tasks, verifying a frequency change, acknowledging a speed assignment, setting flaps, and the risk of attentional tunneling rises. Even a half-second stepped-on transmission that prompts "say again" can pull eyes and minds back inside at the worst time. Communication itself shapes attention. A crisp "traffic in sight" aligns the crew. A negative contact heightens the hunt. In multi-crew jets, this is where CRM either hums or frays. The non-flying pilot calls out bearing and trend. The flying pilot adjusts pitch to maintain stability while leaning into the windscreen. In single pilot operations, the burden stacks. Aviate, navigate, communicate is more than a mnemonic, it is triage. Pilots faced with an ambiguous target often default to altitude discipline. Hold your cleared height and trust the other party to do the same until a definitive cue justifies a change. In the corridor, that patience collides with the need to act early. By the time an intruder looks threatening, maneuvering room may have evaporated. Technology fills gaps but introduces new ones. Portable receivers can drop out in turns. Traffic symbology can clutter and desensitize. Audio alerts can blend with other chimes. In a jet, a late RA can conflict with the stabilized approach criteria that airlines enforce. A climb when configured to land is safe, but high workload. In a small aircraft, a tablet's traffic call-out can arrive 2 or 3 seconds after the pilot has already looked away to answer a controller. Every tool buys seconds, every task spends them. Ask. All of this exists before the sky itself begins to interfere. Visibility, background contrast, sun angle, and the mirror of dark water can turn good scanning into guesswork. In the minutes before impact, the environment over the Potomac added its own filters to what the eyes could see and the sensors could confirm. To understand how much of the risk was baked into the light and weather, we need to examine the conditions that evening and how winter optics skew perception at closing speeds. By the time two aircraft share the same slice of sky, the weather doesn't have to be bad to matter. It only has to be specific. Investigators will parse the Reagan National meter string by string, ceiling visibility, wind, temperature, dew point spread, and match it against tower light settings, bridge illumination, and the luminance of a winter twilight. The Washington area's short days and hard angles create their own environment. In the hour around sunset, the sky presents a steep brightness gradient from the western horizon to the darker east, and the Potomac becomes a mirror that alternately swallows and throws back light. Even when the ASOS prints 10 SM, that figure hides the haze and veiling glare that can soften a strobe at 2 miles and make a set of landing lights look like a street lamp on a bridge. Light geometry is the first quiet factor. A low sun, or, moments later, a just-set sun painting the sky, sits near eye level for crews following the river's bends. Against that glare, the human eye shifts from photopic, daylight, to mesopic, dusk vision, a gray zone where acuity drops and red wavelengths lose punch. That affects what pilots actually perceive. The left wing's red position light appears dimmer sooner than the right wing's green. White strobes can saturate the retina and leave a ghost image just where a pilot needs contrast. Windshields, polished to transparency in hangars, reveal their true condition at dusk. Micro scratches, smears, and internal reflections create a thin fog of light. A single misaligned defogger vent can leave a crescent of condensation that is invisible until headlights bloom behind it. The river adds optics of its own. Over dark water, a head-on target holding a constant bearing can seem fixed until it abruptly swells, a classic constant relative motion problem that training warns about but biology still struggles with. The Potomac's bends multiply that effect. An opposing aircraft rounding a curve can keep the same relative bearing longer, delaying the brain's recognition of closure. Meanwhile, specular reflections from the water or from wet bridge decks throw off white pulses that mimic strobes. At the same time, the monuments and office towers along Rosslyn and the Mall draw clean, stable lines that can act as a false horizon, subtly shifting a pilot's pitch reference and eye angle just when the scan should be leveled at traffic. Visibility in winter often means transparency with texture. A temperature inversion over the city traps particulates and moisture, creating a faint milkiness that doesn't register as mist, but softens edges. Under such conditions, anti-collision lights are visible from farther away, but their cues are less informative. You see the flash, not the aircraft between flashes. The human eye's flicker fusion threshold, roughly 20-60 Hz depending on brightness, also plays a part. Modern LED beacons and strobes are bright, but their flash patterns and rise times can challenge peripheral detection at long distance, while appearing harsh and fatiguing up close, encouraging pilots to avert their gaze. Inside the cockpits, avionics react differently to light than eyes do. TCS doesn't care about glare, but many operators inhibit resolution advisories close to the ground to avoid nuisance commands. In a visual corridor at low altitude, crews often rely on advisories and their eyes. ADS-B, in traffic on moving maps, is immune to twilight, but subject to latency and clutter, and its symbology competes with terrain tints and airspace depictions that are hardest to parse at a glance in dim light. Tablets dim to preserve night vision, yet a dim display can make relative altitude tags harder to read. Brighten it, and the screen becomes a mirror that throws cockpit reflections back at the pilot. Every mitigation buys one kind of visibility by spending another. Wind and temperature shape perception as well as performance. A light southerly breeze, common when runway 19 is active, can lay a small chop along the river as air flows over low buildings and trees on the banks, jiggling the sight picture just enough to turn a steady dot into a jitter. Winter air is dense, ground speeds seem modest, while closure remains unforgiving. Cold prompts heat, and heat produces thermal currents inside cockpits that fog corners of glass interfaces or distort the line between outside and the reflection of an annunciator. Small effects add up at the margins where see and avoid lives. None of this requires clouds or rain. The point borne out by decades of accident and incident literature, is that good VMC can be visually complex, and winter twilights are among the most complex of all. Against a bright sky, strobes can disappear. Against a dark river, they can masquerade as their own reflections. A scan that is textbook at noon can become tentative at 5 p.m., even for crews who know this corridor, stone by stone. On the evening in question, whatever the exact readings, the setting likely subtracted seconds from detection and added ambiguity to every cue. Those same conditions dictated what happened after the sky went quiet. Cold air and colder water, currents running past bridge stanchions, patchy visibility, and the onset of darkness influence how quickly debris is spotted and how safely boats and helicopters can work the channel. In the minutes after impact, the weather and light didn't just shape perception in the air, they set the terms for the search on the water. What followed on the riverbank and across the radios is the next part of this story. The first sign that something irretrievable had happened was not a scream on the frequency, but a gap. A controller issued a routine traffic call. One crew responded clipped, the other did not. On the scope, 2 data blocks merged, and then one winked. Conflict alert tones pierced the room, and the controller's cadence changed. Call signs repeated, headings offered that went unacknowledged. Within seconds, the crash phone circuit was opened, from the tower to airport fire and rescue, and a blanket advisory went out on guard frequency for any aircraft with eyes on the river between the Key and Roosevelt bridges. Over 121.5, someone reported, "Debris in the water by the point, the transmission thin with wind." On shore, people heard what radios flattened. A hard crack, then a long, low roar of water working metal. Joggers near Gravelly Point paused, turned, and dialed 911. Call takers in Arlington and the district collected landmarks, south of the 14th Street Bridge, west of Roosevelt Island, and pushed them to dispatch as multiple agencies lit their maps. In the first minutes, pieces drifted with the current. Foam, fabric, a strip of honeycombed composite, the smell of fuel threading the cold. A small light flickered and then went dark. The river pulled everything toward the channel. The response moved by muscle memory. Metropolitan Washington Airport's Authority fire crews rolled from Reagan National and staged on the service road by the river fence, their crash trucks pointing uselessly at water, but their medics ready. D.C. Fire and EMS launched from the Washington Channel. Their fireboat shouldered north against the current, with the deck lights painting the pilings white. Arlington and Alexandria sent their own marine units from boat ramps along Dangerfield Island and Columbia Island. The U.S. Park Police, who know this stretch stone by stone, put a helicopter over the scene to rake the water with a searchlight, while the Coast Guard declared a temporary safety zone and vectored 29-foot response boats up from Alexandria. Police on the George Washington Parkway shut parking lots and pulled bystanders back from the railings to clear space for stretchers and gear. Aerial operations tightened around the incident. The tower suspended the river visuals and held departures. Approach control vectored arrivals into wide downwinds or sent them to hold west of the field. For a period, the FAA issued a ground stop to Reagan National as the picture stabilized. On the river, rescue priorities simplified. Get markers on the main debris field, look for survivors, life vests, or any movement. Keep track of what the water is doing in the bends. It was full dark, or near enough, and the temperature made time an enemy. Hypothermia begins in minutes in winter water. Rescuers pulled on dry suits and shoulder harnessed their lights. A sheen spread and then thinned. Pieces that looked like hope up close were only objects: seat foam, an intact cargo door, a section of fairing with a serial number that someone taped and photographed. In Washington, any accident near the flight-restricted zone layers security over rescue. The Secret Service, Capitol Police, and Homeland Security liaison officers moved quickly to rule out intent. NORAD's Eastern Air Defense Sector cross-checked radar tapes. None of that slowed the rescue, but it changed the posture. Patrol boats controlled who entered the zone. Air assets kept to discrete orbits. The Coast Guard's broadcast on Channel 16 warned off private vessels. Radios filled with dual tracks. One set of voices working bearings and search patterns, another closing perimeters and collecting IDs of anyone who had seen the collision. Within an hour, a unified command post took shape near the airport fence line, the kind of plywood and tarp tent that springs up on cold nights. Incident commander, operations, safety, public information. Maps of the river went on clipboards. Colored grease pencils marked likely drift lines given wind and current. A landing zone was designated, though it went unused for medevacs. Divers were placed on standby for first light. Inside the tower, controllers began the ritual of securing recordings and logging statements. Out on the water, crews dropped lighted buoys to hold the shape of the field until morning. By midnight, the picture was still incomplete but organized. The airport reopened to limited operations under a modified plan. The river corridor remained closed. Families began to be notified. The first briefings told the public little beyond the fact of an accident and the breadth of the response. The next movement would be slower and more forensic. The NTSB's Go team, the careful lift of wreckage, the parsing of tapes and data that might turn a winter night into a sequence with causes. To understand what those investigators will look for and what the evidence can and cannot say, we turn to the records the system keeps when seconds start to count.